Now, I'd like to turn your attention to today's very special award ceremony for a very distinguished guest. The Combat Anti-Semitism Movement is pleased to honor former United States Secretary of State Michael R. Pompeo with its inaugural Global Leadership Award, which is bestowed on individuals who are models of tolerance and mutual responsibility and are forging the path towards a global future of greater interfaith harmony. Now, this award is being given to former Secretary Pompeo by CAM in recognition of his exceptional and groundbreaking contributions to the fight against anti-Semitism and religious prejudice of all forms, and for his deep and steadfast friendship with the Jewish people and the State of Israel, along with his role in helping to craft the Abraham Accords, which have opened the doors for peace in the Middle East. Now, before we speak with the former U.S. Secretary of State himself, I'd like to invite a human rights icon, the former Soviet refusenik Natan Sharansky, to say a few words to introduce this award. So, Mr. Sharansky, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Natasha. You know, the aim of combat anti-Semitism movement is to establish the front, the global interfaith grassroots front fighting anti-Semitism all over the world on all levels of the government and civil society. And the aim of the Leadership Award, World Leadership Award of our organization is to recognize those individuals who really came with the new initiatives, initiatives which help to unite people of different faiths and different nations in their struggle against this most ancient hatred, anti-Semitism. And why it is so important today? Because anti-Semitism of all types is growing practically everywhere. And at the same time, polarization inside the countries, between left and right, is growing. And as a result, it's so difficult to build bridges between people of different religious views, or different nations, or different political views, to make united front. And here, Michael Pompeo is the first leader who is, he is the first one who is chosen for our Leadership Award. Because of Abraham Accord, you only think it was like shifting paradigm of the idea of how you are bringing peace to the Middle East. For 30 years, for more than 30 years, one after another, leaders were failing to impose peace on the people of the Middle East, sometimes even to empower more and more dictators in order they will be strong enough to impose peace in the Middle East, and it all failed. The Abraham Accords came from the other side. They are unleashing all this energy of people to people. They are helping the people to express their deep desire for dialogue, for tolerance, for living together in security. You know, I had a privilege to meet with the members of the special Royal Institute of Tolerance, Religious Tolerance of Bahrain, those who signed a special memorandum of understanding with Elon Carr on behalf of Michael Pompeo. And I told them, are you sure that you understood that what you are signing, it's not only that you will be fighting against hatred against another Jew, but also against hatred towards Israel? They said, what are you talking about? Of course, not that only we understood, we initiated it. We are going to build secure future in the Middle East. Of course, we are against hatred or demonization of Israel. And recently, on the Holocaust Day, I was participating in the unique webinar on Holocaust, initiated by Israeli Arabs, but the participants were Arabs from Bahrain and from Morocco and even from Syria. And it's all unbelievable changes. It's only the beginning of those changes who are brought through these Abraham Accords. And of course, Michael Pompeo proved himself as a great friend. Was he the architect of these accords? And I'm very glad for having this opportunity and to welcome Michael Pompeo, and our prominent address in the last years in Washington, Elon Carr.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that, Mr. Sharansky. You remain an inspiration to human rights activists and the cause for, fighting anti-Semitism and religious freedom all over the world. So we really appreciate you sitting here with us today. And on this note, I'd like to invite Elon Carr, the former United States Special Envoy for Monitoring and Combating Anti-Semitism. He is here to speak about his experience working with his former boss at the State Department. So, Mr. Carr, you were appointed by Secretary Pompeo to lead the United States' efforts to combat anti-Semitism around the world. Thank you for being with us today, and we'd like to give the floor to you.
Well, thank you so much, and hello, friends. I have the great honor of introducing to you our recipient of the first ever Combat Anti-Semitism Global Leadership Award, my former boss, Secretary Mike Pompeo. Secretary Pompeo has public service in his blood. He graduated first in his class at the United States Military Academy at West Point and served as an Army officer and tank platoon leader. Then, after a successful business career in the Kansas aerospace industry, in 2010, he ran and was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. In January 2017, he left Congress to serve as director of the Central Intelligence Agency. The following year, in April 2018, he was nominated and confirmed to be our Secretary of State. As America's top diplomat, Secretary Pompeo was a tireless advocate for principled American leadership in our world. And this was evidenced in so many ways, not least by his unequivocal commitment to fighting anti-Semitism, protecting the Jewish people throughout the world, and supporting the State of Israel. His accomplishments in this area were unprecedented. He established groundbreaking new policies by declaring that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, that the global BDS campaign is anti-Semitic, and that Israeli settlements are not per se illegal. He helped to lead our historic recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. He helped to lead our country out of the disastrous Iran nuclear deal and imposed crushing sanctions on the world's chief state sponsor of anti-Semitism. He convened the first ever U.S. government-sponsored conference on combating online hate. Thanks to him, products made in Israeli-controlled parts of Judea and Samaria are now labeled Made in Israel, and U.S. passports of Americans born in Jerusalem will at long last identify their country of birth as Israel. And then, as Natan said, there are the Abraham Accords, the realization of a decades-long dream of peace between Israel and an increasing number of her Arab neighbors. Secretary Pompeo was one of the architects of that breathtaking transformation that is building a new and better Middle East for all the region's children. All of this and more led the editorial board of a major Israeli newspaper to write that Secretary Pompeo is, quote, a true, consistent, articulate, and unapologetic friend of the Jewish state. The editorial went on to declare that he is, quote, one of the best friends Israel has ever had as Secretary of State. Now, I know personally that for Secretary Pompeo, the cause of protecting the Jewish people and supporting the State of Israel is a deeply felt passion, stemming from deeply held convictions. His leadership has made an enormous difference, and I could not have been more proud to serve on his team. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great privilege to present to you the 70th Secretary of State of the United States of America, Michael R. Pompeo.
Elon, thank you. What a kind introduction. It's wonderful to see you again. We did amazing work together in combating anti-Semitism around the world. I'm really proud of what we did, and we had a president that would let us do it. It's humbling to be on the same stage with you, Mr. Sharansky. I've read your work, I've watched your work for an awfully long time, and your cause has been noble. I can see you are still hard at it. Know that I am too. And thank you all. Thank you for this award. There were lots of hands that went into making this happen. Lots of hands here in the United States. It wasn't just me. It wasn't just Elon. It took a big group of people who were committed to this in a deep and personal way. We had that. But then it took people all across the world. I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about this. You mentioned the Bahrainis. It took real leaders who were prepared to acknowledge the central set of understandings about this special place of Israel being the rightful homeland of the Jewish people, and preserving and protecting Jews wherever they are around the world from the hatred and anti-Semitism that has scarred so much of our recent history. There's obviously lots more work to do. I intend to stay hard at it, but thank you so much for honoring me today by allowing me to be part of this conversation. Thank you.
All right. Well, of course, it's a pleasure to have you, and we're going to be able to ask you some questions shortly. But first, I would like to turn everyone's attention to a short video segment in which we explore the very reasons behind this year's Global Leadership Award recipient. Take a look.
Let me go on record. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism.
30 days from now, all the sanctions that were in place will resume, and the world will be a safer place.
With the dark wave of anti-Semitism rising in Europe and in the United States, all nations, especially those in the West, must go to the barricades against bigotry.
We will regard the global anti-Israel BDS campaign as anti-Semitic.
Welcome, everyone. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo here. It's a pleasure to speak with you, alongside so many important leaders from the United States and from our allies all around the world. Nowadays, bigots everywhere can spread anti-Semitism anonymously online. They ludicrously blame the Jewish people for the spread of COVID-19.
Today I'll get a chance to visit the Golan Heights. The simple recognition of this as part of Israel, too, was a decision President Trump made that is historically important and simply a recognition of the reality. We're also gravely concerned about the threat the court poses to Israel.
The Combat Anti-Semitism movement recognizes former United States Secretary of State Michael R. Pompeo for his exceptional and groundbreaking contributions to the fight against anti-Semitism and religious prejudice of all forms, his deep and steadfast friendship with the Jewish people and State of Israel, and his role in crafting the Abraham Accords, which have opened the doors for peace in the Middle East and created new allies in the battle against the world's oldest hatred. We are pleased to honor Mr. Pompeo with the first ever Combat Anti-Semitism Global Leadership Award, bestowed on exemplars of the values of tolerance and mutual responsibility who are forging the path toward a global future of greater interfaith harmony.
As we just witnessed, former Secretary Pompeo has been a steadfast ally in the struggle against anti-Semitism. And now it's my honor to introduce former United States Secretary of State Michael Pompeo, who's joining us in the studio today live for an exclusive interview about his work to combat anti-Semitism. Now, Secretary Pompeo, welcome and congratulations on receiving this important CAM Global Leadership Award. Now, you're not Jewish, and there aren't many Jews in the Kansas district that you represented in Congress. Yet when you became Secretary of State, you not only made a point of filling the anti-Semitism envoy position, which had been vacant for over a year at that point, but you also added several deputies and elevated the office as an important branch of the State Department. So Why was this so important for you to take these steps? As a non-Jew, why do you believe that tackling anti-Semitism is so important?
Well, Natasha, I've been at this for a long time. Long before I entered government service, I knew the importance of Israel to the United States as a security partner, and I knew the history of the hatred of Jewish people. We all know the history from World War II and the Holocaust. Something that's deeply personal for me. When I was a young cadet at West Point now, too long ago, I studied the wars 1967 and 1973. I'm an evangelical Christian who has taken great interest in reading the history of the Hebrew Bible as well. I've come to know that this place, Jerusalem, and this land is so special to so many around the world. And to see anti-Semitism rise, to see the risk that it presents to the Jewish people is something that no one, no American, no one anywhere in the world ought to tolerate. And so when I got this chance to serve as America's Secretary of State, I knew I wanted to use every moment that I had, every energy that the State Department could bring to bear on this. So I built out a team. Elon came to lead it. We built out a big team that worked on this alongside with Ambassador Brownback, who was working on a broader set of religious freedom issues as well. We understood that if we didn't get this right, if we sloughed off, if we allowed this to be something that wasn't prioritized inside of the United States government, that the risk to the Jewish people and the Jewish homeland would increase. So it was something that was important for me personally as a man of faith, but also something, my duty to the United States and my moral obligation to people of all faiths around the world. Understood that we had to get this fight against anti-Semitism right, and we needed to put every piece of energy we had into that fight.
Now, after a gunman attacked a synagogue in Halle, Germany, you made a point of visiting the temple. And last Yom Kippur, while you were in Greece, you also made a point of visiting with the Jewish community in Saloniki. What insights did you gain seeing these small European Jewish communities that have faced vicious anti-Semitism in the past and in the present?
So Halle, Germany was very special to get a chance to go there and to visit the synagogue and to sit down with the leaders there. They had just been through a horrific tragedy. I got a chance to pray with them and to be with them. And I wanted the world to see that America's Secretary of State was watching, we were counting, we were measuring. It's a special place too, because Germany has a unique history with respect to anti-Semitism as well. So it was really important for me to go there and express America's sympathy with the people who had suffered such a great tragedy, but also to make the case for how we were going to combat this and how we were going to protect this kind of thing from happening again. Salonika is another example. This was a small, historic European community inside of Greece. I had a chance to go visit them and see their small museum, which traces the history of European jewelry. I've known this history from friends. You talked about there being a small community in Wichita. It's true, but these are important people, people of faith, and we wanted to make sure always to protect and preserve even that community in Wichita, Kansas. We wanted to make sure they had a place to safely worship and to practice their faith in the way that they desired to practice it. And so whether you're in Kansas or in Greece or in Germany, it's always important for American leaders to get out and to be with the Jewish people and express our support and express that we are working diligently to do all that we can to combat anti-Semitism wherever we find it, whether it's the most vicious form in attacks like we saw in Germany or the softer forms of anti-Semitism we see in our schools and in our communities all across the world today.
All right. Now, I'd like to turn to the Abraham Accords. Obviously, this is a topic that we have mentioned already several times, but for decades, the Middle East was arguably the main place where overt anti-Semitism flourished. But now the Abraham Accords has brought a sea of change in the region. In a sense, the old Arab-Israeli conflict is over, and it's creating new opportunities to advance philo-Semitism. So how optimistic are you about the long-term implications of these accords? And do you think that they're going to lead to reduced anti-Semitism and greater religious tolerance in the region?
So I'm incredibly optimistic. There's so much to say about these accords. But without focusing on the accords themselves for just a minute, what Mr. Sharansky spoke to is exactly right. Look, for an awfully long time, for decades and decades, in U.S. foreign policy, and frankly in European foreign policy as well, there was a central understanding. It was this: if you cannot resolve once and for all, and in its totality, the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, no dice. You can't advance peace. You can't advance stability. The Arab-Israeli conflict will continue. If you can keep there from being a war or an intifada, so much the better, but you're not going to fundamentally make any significant change. The great news is that was just all wrong. The bad news is it took us 2 or 3 decades to figure our way through that. It took President Trump and our team to acknowledge that, no, you could build peace, you could build stability, and you could do so even while trying to impart a better situation between Israel and the Palestinians. But if that conflict couldn't be resolved, if the Palestinian leadership continued to say no and no and no, then we were going to move on and forward and allow people from other places in the Middle East, other Arabs, to say, no, we don't want to base our relationship with Israel on hatred. We don't want to base it on anger. We don't want to simply say that we're going to allow the Palestinians to deny us the capacity to have a relationship with Israel. And they did it. They did it because it's right for their people. They did it because it's the morally appropriate thing to do. What you'll see, I think, and why I'm optimistic is because I think now we've unleashed this. I think this is happening. It took an American leadership team that was prepared to help facilitate it, but now I think it will stand the test of time. I think people in these places aren't going back. The people in Sudan, the people in Bahrain, the people in the Emirates, in each of these places, now Morocco has begun to allow more to take place. The Saudis have now allowed a much more open set of relationships. I think you're going to see people in this region simply say, look, the Jewish homeland of Israel is rightful. It's appropriate. We want them to be diplomatic friends. We want them to be economic partners. We want them to be security allies. And I think you will begin to see this grow and grow and grow and take on a momentum. And I am hopeful. I'm hopeful one day that this momentum will allow the people that live alongside Israel, the Palestinians, to see that they too must get on board with this. I hope, and I know we'll talk about this later, I'm sure we will, I hope we see people in the most anti-Semitic nation in the world today, in Iran. I hope the people of Iran come to see this is the right thing to do and cease to chant death to Israel and death to the United States, but rather welcome them into this union that simply recognizes the rightful place of the Jewish people in the homeland in Israel. I'm very optimistic.
So we're going to get to the future, but as someone who was there on the front lines as these accords were coming together, what changes did you see firsthand? Take us inside the room, to better understand these breakthrough negotiations. Are there any key aspects of the peace diplomacy that the public doesn't fully appreciate at this point?
Oh, there's a bunch. I think first, there was a reason it took 3 decades. There was lots of resistance to what it was we were trying to accomplish. There was resistance in the U.S. policy community that said, you can't do this until you get it right. And so we began, if you'll recall, with a meeting in Warsaw, Poland, where we, for the first time, Prime Minister Netanyahu attended, foreign ministers from the Gulf states attended. They were in the same place. They were in the same room. It was absolutely historic. It was underreported. But that was the moment when I knew I could see the goodwill and commitment on both sides, on the Israeli side and on the Arab side, to figure our way through this thing. And in a special place, a place with so much history, in Warsaw, Poland, the Polish government was wonderful to have hosted that event. It was the very beginning of the set of understandings that culminated in the Abraham Accords. But the resistance didn't just come from the U.S. foreign policy establishment. The Russians would have preferred this didn't happen. The recorders in Europe that would have preferred that this did not happen. They wanted to hold out. They wanted to maintain the fiction that this conflict between Israel and the Palestinians was the end-all and be-all for the Middle East and Middle East stability. But once that shibboleth was destroyed, once you could see that you could do these things and there wouldn't be World War III, there wouldn't be another intifada, when leaders came to see that we could piece this together, we could patch this together and create warm relationships between these nations, you could see the diplomatic efforts begin to thrive and grow. And you could see people of faith, from Christians to Jews to Muslims, come to understand this was the right approach. It was the path forward for Middle East stability, and that there was the possibility that we could achieve this moment. It took many, many months. It took lots of meetings. It took great leadership from leaders in the Emirates and in Bahrain and elsewhere. They had to be bold. We had the right people in the right places working on the right problem set at the right moment, and it came together in a set of historic understandings that will change the face of the globe for decades and decades to come.
We obviously have to ask, I think that everybody has been wondering this, which Muslim country do you think is going to be the next to normalize ties with Israel? Perhaps Saudi Arabia?
I'm really bad at predictions. I'm good at grinding through problem sets, but predicting the future has proven a struggle for me. I don't think there'll be just one. I think there'll be many more. I hope that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia can find its way to join the Abraham Accords. I know many inside that country want that to take place, but there are other nations too that can join all of those countries, right? I hadn't mentioned Jordan and Egypt that have reached their own separate peace with Israel as well. We need every country all across the world. Muslim nations, not just in the Middle East, but places like Indonesia as well. I'm confident that through time they will make the right decision for their people, make the right decision for Israel, and indeed the right decision for the world.
Now, let's turn to Iran, another issue that is making the headlines consistently. The regime in Iran continues to threaten Israel with destruction. The Pakistani Supreme Court just freed Daniel Pearl's murderer. Anti-Semitism is on the rise on both the far left and the far right, and not to mention rampant Islamist anti-Semitism. What concerns you the most when you look at the latest anti-Semitic trends that we're seeing in both the United States and abroad, and what do you attribute this rise in anti-Semitism to?
Well, there's kind of two different questions in there. I'll take the second one first. So this rise in anti-Semitism is something that is deeply troubling. We saw it from the left, political left, not just the political left in the United States, but the political left all across the world, including in the United States and Europe. We also saw it from the right, but from wherever it comes, or if it's Islamist anti-Semitism, wherever it emanates from, we across the world, people of faith all across the world, from whatever religion, have an obligation to do our best to stamp it out. And while we have made progress, we still have institutions, educational institutions, institutions all across the world that haven't come to the same understanding, and we need to make sure they get the attention and the education right so that they understand that these historic myths, these stories that seem to continue to perpetuate themselves, are knocked down and the truth is told once and for all. You began the question with Iran.
Yes.
The Abraham Accords would not have happened. It was not possible for them to happen without the United States changing its policy with respect to Iran 180 degrees from how the previous administration had addressed that issue. The previous administration had decided to make a deal which addressed a singular component of the threat from Iran, its nuclear program, and even with respect to that singular component, had frankly created an inevitable pathway for a nuclear weapon for the Iranians. We came in and just flipped the script. And absent that, absent convincing Arab states all across the region that the United States was serious, that we would defend them and their interest when necessary, and that we were going to hold the Iranians accountable for the threats that they posed, not only to Israel, but the threat that they posed to Kuwait, the threat that they posed to Oman, the threats that they posed to the Saudis, to the Emiratis, to people all across the region, that the United States was going to address this threat. I don't think it would have been possible for their leadership to enter into these historic accords. And so we did. I remember being told, America can't go this alone. American sanctions won't work. Well, ask the Ayatollah, ask Javad Zarif, ask Rouhani if our sanctions worked. They worked tremendously. And we put real pressure on the Iranian regime and denied them resources to underwrite Hezbollah, to underwrite Shia militias in Iraq, to underwrite their activities in Syria. We denied them an enormous amount of money. They now say they want $1 trillion in reparations from this administration to go back into the deal. $1 trillion, okay, fair enough. We cost them $1 trillion. That pressure reduced the risk of terror throughout the region, and America was strong. When Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general, responsible for so much mayhem and so much risk, and the risk of death to people all across the region, killed hundreds of Americans. When Qasem Soleimani threatened the United States of America, President Trump was prepared to do the right thing, and we killed him. And we took out a general who had been responsible for so much harm throughout the region. I think when leaders in the Arab world saw that the United States was prepared to do this, to push back against Iran, to push back against the IRGC leadership in the person of Qasem Soleimani, they knew they had a friend and a partner, and they knew that they could proceed down a path which their people wanted and work against anti-Semitism and build out a set of accords with the state of Israel. These are not disconnected issues. They are deeply connected. One could not happen without the other. And our holistic approach to how we thought about the Middle East has led to this historic opportunity that the Israelis now have and Arab states now have to join together to make a stronger, more stable, more peaceful, and more tolerant Middle East.
Now, we'd like to turn to your career more specifically and kind of get a sense about what it was like. What were two key defining moments in your tenure as Secretary of State where you had to make bold decisions that weren't easy, and how did you navigate those decisions?
Well, goodness, one of the things that was the most complex was the conversations we had with Chairman Kim. I began them when I was actually the CIA director on a clandestine trip that I took on Easter of 2000, and I think it must have been 2018. The President knew that the nuclear threat from North Korea was real. You'll remember we were all pretty fired up. The President tweeted about fire and fury. We are attempting to reestablish deterrence with the North Koreans who were continuing to conduct missile tests. And so to go and travel to Pyongyang to meet with Chairman Kim, to try to deliver on the President's diplomatic efforts, again, was something that, frankly, few administrations would have done. To have a summit between these two leaders was something that was incredibly challenging and I think defined the way we approached the world. The meetings didn't ultimately end in exactly the outcome we would have hoped, but there still hasn't been a long-range missile test. There still haven't been nuclear tests from North Korea. Chairman Kim has lived up to those promises. There obviously remains more work to do. But we grounded this in reality, the reality of where North Korea was, and we did the same in the Middle East. You know, the second one I alluded to already. I remember those who said we couldn't move the embassy to Jerusalem. And I remember the opposition inside the United States government as well that said, no, a strike against Qasem Soleimani will inflame the region. But in fact, did just the opposite. We recognized the reality of Jerusalem as the rightful homeland of Israel, as the Golan Heights is appropriately contained inside of the state of Israel. Those central facts, recognition of those, took real strength from a president. It took real effort on behalf of the State Department to deliver on those outcomes in a way that established what I think the world needs: strength, clarity, transparency, the willingness to deter, the capacity to take a strike when necessary to be restrained when it's not. Those are the things I think that will define the 4 years of President Trump and my time as CIA Director and Secretary of State. And I hope many of those things, those central understandings of the reality of how foreign policy can deliver good outcomes for America and the world, I hope those will remain.
All right, so our final question for you is a very important one. You have been here in Israel. You traveled to Israel not too long ago. And we'd like to know what stood out to you the most about the state of Israel, about your time here.
Goodness, I've been so blessed to travel to Israel many times. It's always the people. My first trip to Israel was long before I was in the government. We took our son when I think he was 15 years old on a family trip, just Susan, me, and Nick. We had a chance to travel to the Golan Heights to walk the battlefields from 1973. We met a young Israeli tank company commander. We compared the M1 tank to the Merkava. It was a lot of fun. That's a great example. People dedicated to their own nation, people desirous of preserving peace, people who like to have a little fun. On my final trip, I had the good fortune to be able to travel to Judea and Samaria to see some people in that region too. No Secretary of State had gone there before. We had a chance to have a lunch and just chat. Good people of goodwill trying to do the right thing for themselves, for their families, for their community, for their nation. And this is what I'll remember about Israel. These are remarkable people, not only the Jews of Israel, but the Arabs and other religious minorities there too, living in harmony inside of a country committed to peace and stability in the entire region. It was a blessing to get to know so many Israelis during my time in service.
All right. Well, on that note, congratulations again, Mr. Secretary, and thank you for all that you have done to ensure the future of religious tolerance and interfaith harmony, especially here in Israel.
Thank you. Thank you for being such a good friend of our people and of our country. And thank you for choosing Elon Carr as our partner and our address for many years. Thank you.